you're exploring in this movie, very similar to the themes in Margin Call, themes of corruption, greed. I'm just curious about what fascinates you with those subjects, and what did you want to explore with those themes in
Most Violent Year? Yeah, I think for me, this idea that within capitalism that there's sort of bad, good, nothing in between, which often, it's us versus them kind of a situation, to me is something that should be explored, because it's not true for the most part, and it's also just something that fascinates me, right? Which is we sort of all live by these certain rules that are set up about money and time and talent and what things are worth and what we get paid, and it affects everything we do every day, basically. So people that are sort of at moments in their life where they're either getting a comeuppance, where in Margin Call it was sort of a history of kind of flagrant speculation and risk-taking beyond the point of sort of safety. And then you're there when you get to see those people kind of square that down. For me, was representational of like what a lot of us did, myself included in that time, of course on a much smaller scale, but ringing up bills you can't pay, that money you don't have, and that's essentially all those bankers were doing, and they were trying to make a buck while doing it. So I start these things as a writer first, and I'm just writing movies that I would love to go see and that I want to spend 3 years of my life making, sometimes a lot longer. And so, that where the rubber meets the road of how people actually live their lives and why they make the decisions that they do, kind of fascinates me. I had sort of two ideas rolling around in my head. One was this idea of a family-run and family-owned business between a husband and wife, and what that kind of ambition and that combination of ambition was, and how that ties into sort of immigrants and first or second generation immigrants and the American dream. And so I was playing with that story. And then there was this idea of kind of investigating violence, and really violence in movies. I was being offered all these films to write and years later to direct, that were sort of really violent and not really in the sort of Quentin Tarantino way of making a film, but just sort of violence for violence sake, basically, just as a form of a commodity. Because I wasn't getting offered the good stuff, I was getting offered the like B- projects. So I was just analyzing that, right? Why am I being offered these movies? And then those two ideas kind of merged together, and I found myself searching through crime statistics in New York City, and saw this huge wave of crime that kind of crested in 1981, which is, for the most part, the most violent year on record in New York City history. 91 kind of competes with it in some categories, but that was much more isolated geographically. So 81 was just this, sort of massively transformational period for New York City, when it made a decision about what kind of a future it wanted. Did it want to kind of fall into the wild, wild west where everyone was walking around with a gun on their holster, or was it going to take a different path? So the movie was never intended, although it's playing off that expectation by the title, to show you every act of violence that was going on in New York at that time. What it was meant to show is a representation of one business and one family-run business and their immediate family dealing with trying to live amongst that violence. So when there's horrible, horrible times, there's sort of an initial act of violence, and the immediate repercussions are horrible for both the perpetrator and the victim. And then from there, it's sort of these ripples, right, that kind of go out. So if there's some horrible event on a college campus, you have the immediate act and everyone around it. And then really the way everyone changes their lives because of that. And so these guys are meant to be normal people running a medium-sized family-run business, like many other people out in the world, trying to operate their lives in that environment. So although compared against other movies, the movie's not that violent, compared against life, it's a pretty terrible year. You know, there's probably 12 or 13 pretty violent acts throughout the film that if they happened to either of you, me or you, it would be a pretty bad year, right? Like, and so the movie was basically these people that were trying to isolate themselves from that violence, right? They're moving out of the city. Their office complex has a walled compound with a big gate every time they want to leave or close the place. So they're driving around in these big German cars. So they are essentially trying to isolate themselves from the reality of what's going on and put their head in the sand. And that only, as we're learning today, you can only kind of push down, certain problems for so long before they kind of rear their head.